Ooh, that was fun. I just had my back crack right before I started. Hello everybody. Welcome to the stream. I'm here tonight. It's me. You can see there's a cat already back there, so we're already off to a good start. Which one are you? Ah, it is Phoebe. The unofficial channel mascot, if I recall correctly. So, here we are. Step Back Tonight. Episode, oh gosh, we're up to a number 11 now. Jeez. Okay. So, for anyone who is out there, anyone who's out there, you could definitely say that. Anyway, oh gosh, flubbing my lines. I am I'm still adjusting to the 9 to 5, so I'm a little out of it right now since, you know, I was at work 2 hours ago and commuting for most of the time in between. So I'm still like getting there. Anyways. Tonight is the 11th episode of Step Back Tonight, which is a weekly stream that I do with my friends, you guys, in the chat. I usually end up talking to you guys, and we usually do something every episode. So, you know, last week was my birthday, so we did a fun little birthday stream. And tonight we're going to do part of this Alternate Histories series where we kind of push the Elseworld button, like that episode of, what's it called, Futurama, where we go back in time and we change something and we speculate about why things might be different. And in doing so, we learn a valuable lesson about history and about how things are caused by other things. I know most people see it as just a form of entertainment, but there actually is a learning aspect to it, and I'm going to try to sneak that in as much as I can. Let's see how things are going. Okay, so let's start with a couple questions. So, do you think it's unethical for Skillshare or Great Courses to advertise themselves as an alternative to a real college or university? Depends. I mean, they don't do that that explicitly. I, in my very recent video, had a sponsorship for Skillshare, which obviously you weren't a fan of. But in the video, I mentioned that it was a useful alternative in what I called the post-credential present in the fight for jobs. And I don't think that they advertise themselves as like a flat-out straight alternative to going to university. I don't think any of them do. Because, like, you know, there's a whole lot of intangible and different experiences you get from going to university. Not to mention, there's the whole, like, doing assignments and getting grades and getting accreditation that are big deals. But there's lots of stuff that you can do. I think that these websites are really great ways to empower lifelong learners. I am live, right? Okay, yes. Like, in my mind, sites like Skillshare and the Great Courses Plus and such, Great Courses Plus, you know, hit me up. These websites, the service they provide is that they help out with giving people something to learn when you don't necessarily always get access to such things. And sometimes, and even in some cases, there are skills that make you much more valuable as a worker that you can learn on these sites that you don't necessarily have the time or money to do an entire college degree for. Especially if it's just going to be something that's for a side project or for a side business, or you're trying to learn some important things in order to get, like, you know, angle for promotions and things like that. Like learning how to edit videos. Like for me, I've never been at a point in my life where I'm like, all right, I'm going to go become a movie maker. Time to pack up go to film school time. Like, that's not going to happen. If I didn't have Lynda or Skillshare or anything like that, and I wanted to learn Adobe After Effects, I basically would have been limited to sites like just like YouTube tutorials, which like is fine if you're like really, really motivated, but like honestly, compared to like the courses that I've gotten off Skillshare for Adobe After Effects, like I've been doing After Effects for years, looking up random YouTube tutorials all the time, but like nothing comes close to like what I've been able to do on Skillshare. Like Skillshare had like the Skillshare course I took on Adobe After Effects was freaking baller. I have learned so much in like this one course that I'm hopefully going to be translating into videos. I learned something really cool today that I hope to play around with a bit more in the next video. But yeah, I know that they are, you know, a capitalist institution, but like as far as things you have to spend money on, you get bang for your buck. Especially compared to like just going to like community college, if you're not, you know, angling for the actual diploma. But like shit, like if I ever got a free subscription to Great Courses Plus, then I would probably not just like, you know, watch a bunch of courses on history, but I'd probably learn about a bunch of other stuff that I wouldn't have been able to take at university because I was playing towards a degree. So I think that that stuff has value. And now I know it's like educational content behind a paywall, but it's a much lighter paywall than a lot of other ways to get education. And so, you know, that's where I'd be at. And yeah, like I've gotten other sponsorship offers before, but this is the first one where I felt really comfortable taking the sponsorship. Like I got approached, I don't remember the name of it anymore, but I got approached not too long ago by like some, I don't know, mobile game or something, some mobile game developer that wanted me to make a video about, I want to say, maybe it was like World of Tanks or something. They wanted me to make a video about tanks, and I was just like, you know, I was just like, what can I do? So I was choosy, and I actually talked this over with my sponsors, or with my patrons back in the day. So, you know, what can you do? Skillshare was a good example, and I would probably only want to shill for companies that I feel at least okay about, or companies where I really want the free thing that the product that they're shilling for. So, like, if that company that makes mattresses that are in boxes ever wants to do a step back video, I could really use a new mattress. Anyways, this is just me being goofy, all right? You look kind of stoned. Well, Emre, I am not stoned. I am tired. It's the only... that's it. I'm not like... I've had a long day, and yeah. Oh. So I'm a little brain fried. Whew. All right. Let's just... I'm going to clear some of the should probably put the alternate histories in a different tab so that I can keep this all tracked. Okay. All right. Not to mention, I also like did that whole thing with making that video. That basically that AIDS video had me staying up really late on Sunday night, and that has basically been like causing this like cascade effect to like, you know, to make me such a kind of slow person today. So that's where I'm at. All right. Hopefully I'll perk up once we actually start moving. I just need to wake up. Okay. Thank you, Michael Kirshner, for the compliment on the AIDS video. All right. Yeah. Okay. So, why didn't Roman imperialism lead to the creation of racism like early modern imperialism did? Okay. Well, first of all, the delineation of slave status based on skin color was a thing that took several centuries to develop and had to do with a bunch of different factors. So, like, in the case of imperialism, as far as Rome goes, Rome didn't exactly have the same sort of colonial structure that, say, like a European colony would have later. The Romans were still racist, though, right? Not in the same way, and really not what you would really think. The whole idea of creating castes of people based on skin color was not really a thing back then. Wasn't really even a thing in the colonial world until a lot later, and I'll talk about getting into that in a second. So, racism, the whole creating class structures and caste systems based on skin color, didn't happen because the people that the Romans were invading were white people for the most part, except for a few people in like Northern Africa. For example, like when they started taking Carthage and Egypt and the Middle East. They started getting some people. But, like, honestly, their colonization was not the same way that, like, European colonization worked. Romans would expand into an area and basically put in maybe a praetor to rule the place, like a provincial leader. But for the most part, they would be pretty hands-off in their approach. And also the Romans tended to build infrastructure and things like that, so it actually tended to become pretty beneficial pretty fast for a lot of them. And even the people who lived on the periphery, you know, benefited from such a arrangement. But they still spread through the sword and spread through conquest, and that was still nasty. And they did practice slavery, although it was a very different form of slavery. It was one that was a lot less involved. Like, I guess, like, classical world slavery was just really different. It was based on terms of purchase, and also there was no blood quantum aspect to it. Like, there was no, like, if you were a child of this person, you are instantly born into slavery. There was also the potential to buy yourself out of slavery. Like, you weren't, like, racial caste systems of slavery tried to tell people to, or tried to, like, you know, force people of a certain skin color to stay in bondage. And that was a big problem. That kind of caused a lot of issues. And so in Roman slavery, they were slavery wasn't as like was very varied in what it could be and what people could have. Like, there were slaves who were actually rather high status because they were owned by a large and powerful family. There were, like, house servants or people like the seneschal would be slaves, and the seneschal is like a person who takes care of a large estate and is sort of like he or she makes the, like, you know, the functions of the house day to day happen. And that person would usually be a slave, but they would be pretty they would be pretty well off. They might not get paid, but they would have everything taken care of, and they probably live in pretty good conditions. And in the Roman age, I would probably say that the slaves in the Roman society were a lot closer to being like being it's just like a wage system. It's just that you can't quit, I guess, is the answer. But like the slave system in like the Americas, the whole Creole slave system, started off actually not too dissimilar from this. Sorry, keep fidgeting. Put this over here. Maybe see if I can find my fidget cube. It'll help me. I got a fidget spinner, so I'll be cool with all the Gen Z kids. Yay. All right. So in the colonial system, beginning in like the early colonial days, they started to try and grow. They either tried to enslave indigenous peoples, which was brutal and led to mass die-offs, which was really nasty. And then there was then they started making buying from the slave traders in the coast of West Africa and on the western coast of Africa. And they had them send over to certain places. And what happened is that very quickly the economy of the Americas, especially in like what would become the Caribbean and the southern United States, became cash crops. Just crops that when you grow them, they are worth crap tons of money. In the Caribbean, it was sugar. And in like the American South, it was originally it was tobacco and rice. And oftentimes they would buy like to grow crops requires a lot of backbreaking labor. Like the thing with mines is that mines in the early modern period are just flat out dangerous. So slave labor was used because they considered indigenous people to basically be disposable. Especially silver mines, because they ended up having to handle a lot of mercury, which was not good. So, like actually, like the silver mines tended to be a place where they sent like slaves that they really had that they had done something wrong in their eyes, like they were. It was a whole thing. Anyways, so in these cash crop situations, the slaves who worked those plantations were it was backbreaking work, and it was work all the time. It's a situation where on farms, the more labor you get, the more your output can be. And even then, there was a lot of variation. If you ever want to read about this, there's a really long and really dense and really cool but strange book called Slave Counterpoint, which was a discussion of slavery in the 1600s. And in the 1600s in the southern United States, there were different types of plantations, and they roughly bundled them under two types of slave systems. One was gang slavery, and the other was task slavery. And gang slavery was something pretty similar to what you would think of as like chattel slavery today. Like they lined up people and worked them on a field nonstop until they the time ran out. And those were used commonly on smaller plantations, specifically ones that grew tobacco, because tobacco was very labor intensive. And on top of that, it required a bit more knowledgeable handwork. Like the slaves that were bought for tobacco plantations tended to be older, tended to be single, and also they got a lot of indentured servants to work on tobacco plantations as well, because they needed semi-skilled labor. They needed adults. They needed people who were willing to do a little bit more complicated work on smaller plantations, because tobacco basically destroys the soil that it grows on, and so tobacco plantations tended to be not too large because there's only really one field or two fields that could be worked at any given time. Rice plantations, these were in places like the Carolinas, were way different. They were gigantic plantations, took up lots and lots of space. And while the growing of rice is labor intensive, it's not as labor intensive as, say, growing tobacco would be, especially in like intense agricultural situations. And does tobacco make the worker sick as well? Yes, it does. So on rice plantations, you would find that there was the situation that was set up there was actually closer to like peasantry, like a system like the feudal system, where on these like Carolinian plantations, you would have slave owners or plantation owners, but I repeat myself, who would buy in bundles. They would buy entire families of slaves from the slave market, and they would have the family live together on the plantation, usually taking care of one section of the plantation land. Usually they lived on that land, and they had basically a quota that they had to make that day, and the overseer would maybe see them in the morning and say, all right, like, you have to make this much today, and that was it. You just had to have that amount ready by the end of the day. That's all they cared about. And so on these rice plantations, these families would work until they got all the stuff that they needed, and then anything that they did after that was their own stuff. It was their own time to make their own labor, which meant that some people in this period, because things were a lot more loose, were doing extra work after they had made their quota for the day. And they were spending it to make more money for themselves, but also they would save up their money typically and buy their own freedom. And this happened in several cases in like very early colonial America, like I said, 1600s, 1700s, even early 1700s. You see this this process where you see like these large sprawling Carolinian rice plantations, and these small, intense, tobacco plantations in like Virginia and stuff. And on top of that, they also relied a lot on indentured servants as well as slaves, especially on the tobacco plantations. And indentured servants were... Did you get better in Assassin's Creed? I played it again once I got my controller. I got basically to the point where we got when I stopped playing. So when I pick it up again, you'll see. But it's a little bit better when I have a controller. Anyways, so they bought indentured servants who were poor people who lived in Europe, who would get, they would have somebody pay for their transportation across the Atlantic, and in turn they would do 7 years of labor for the person, for whoever owned them, who owned their contract anyway. And they could trade these contracts and things like that. So it was basically like a term of slavery. And after that 7 years, they were permitted to, there was this whole idea that they'd be promised land and a farm of their own where they could then, make their own life. What happened, though, is that very early on, the death rate of these indentured servants was pretty high. So it was easy to give anybody who survived 7 years land, because very rarely did they ever make the full 7 years. But as things started getting better, more and more of those indentured servants started surviving to finish and expect their land. And very quickly, because of the limits put upon them by treaties with the indigenous peoples, they ran out of territory very quickly, and they were basically in a situation where they couldn't do... they couldn't give them land anymore, and they kept trying to restrict them because, most of the land in those provinces were owned by just a few extremely wealthy landlords. And they weren't going to give up their own wealth. And so there was actually For example, in Virginia, there was a rebellion about this, and it's called Bacon's Rebellion, which I think in American history, if anybody ever asked me, like, what's, like, the single most underrated event in American history, or if anybody asked me, like, what's the most important event in defining the United States, I always say it was Bacon's Rebellion. Because this was a rebellion by indentured servants who were trying to get their the things that they were, they thought they were expected to get through their indentured servant contract. And when it ended, it resulted in the colonies in the South making the decision that they were going to stop relying on indentured servants, and that they were going to rely more on slaves. And from this point onward, that's when you find the southern states buying way more slaves from Africa than they bought. Actually, not from Africa. They actually typically did not buy slaves directly from Africa. What they would do, actually, there was this thing called, in a triangular slave trade, there was something called seasoning, which was that the first place that a lot of people who were captured in Africa would end up is in the Caribbean, usually for the British colonies in Jamaica or the Dominican. Or not the Dominican, sorry, just Jamaica. And when they got to Jamaica, they would work on sugar plantations for a couple years just to see if they were suited to the work, but also on top of that, to see if they were capable of surviving the diseases related to heat. And so a lot of them died of malaria and yellow fever and all sorts of types of diseases that come with living in a tropical environment and being forced to live in close quarters with each other. And those who could survive that were called seasoned slaves, because it meant that they had developed an immunity to a lot of these diseases, or at least a resistance to some of these diseases. And they would be seasoned slaves. And then those would be resold on the colonial mainland for like a better price. But that was typically how a lot, I'm not saying all of them, but a good chunk of slaves who were captured in Africa, that was kind of their story of getting across the Atlantic. So that, yeah, it's brutal. This is people being captured and sold against their will into permanent slavery. Now, the Bacon's Rebellion also put in some other regulations on slaves, because like if you read books like there's a book called Mine Own Ground, which is a story about a Creole slave who bought his own freedom and the freedom of his wife and children, and then he bought himself his own farm and then grew stuff on that farm and then started getting slaves of his own. So he was like this black man in the South who had slaves of his own. And that was more common of a thing in this like early Atlantic world. Because now a lot of historians who study this period do what's called Atlantic history instead of American history, because these different locations were all so interconnected. So a lot of slaves, so like after Bacon's Rebellion, the racial angle of slavery was played up. And so they realized they were going to depend on African slaves instead of indentured servants, which meant that they were going to make a whole caste system based on it. And it was this point when they said that being born in slavery means that you are a slave, and if you visibly look like you are black, you are going to be destined to be a slave. There is like a skin color, because they relied so much on African slaves, they used skin color as the marker to determine who was in what caste of society. And that is really like those kinds of relationships that showed up in the early modern colonial story. That is the kinds of relationships that caused what we would today traditionally call racism. This is where the structures of society became designed to benefit different groups of people over each other based on the color of their skin, which is not something you saw in Rome. In Rome, skin color probably didn't mean nothing, but it definitely didn't hurt you as much as people would think. There's evidence that we found of North African powerful rulers in the Roman Empire. You had one of the big stories. This is one of the ones that set Paul Joseph Watson off a few months ago, or maybe about a year ago now, where there was a North African Roman general or Roman praetor or something like that who was ruling in Britain, which shows that the Roman Empire was very big and had people from all over the Mediterranean world, and they looked like all sorts of different types of people, and it didn't really seem that race was really that big a deal. And then on top of that, you even see in the Middle Ages that you have I think there's a famous, I want to say French knight or British knight, I think French. There was a famous French knight who was black, and he was called something the Black, but there was never this strict government structure that permanently disenfranchises people based on skin color. That was just not a thing that existed until you got to the colonial system. And this is why I like to say that racism in many ways is the legacy of colonization. And that part of moving past racism is decolonizing the world, which means you have to find justice for all of these historical injustices. Didn't slaves take part in Bacon's Rebellion? Bacon's Rebellion is very early American history, and my expertise is more in post-Civil War America, but there might have been, but if they were definitely not at the bargaining table when when the rebellion was over. And definitely the rebellion started on the promises of land that were given to indentured servants. But yeah, so that's how racism became a thing. And that racism is a thing that developed, and it is a specific context of the history of colonization. All right. Are there potential sponsors that you would reject even if they gave you exorbitant amounts of money, millions or billions? Yeah. Oh God. Honestly, I'm just glad that is not a question that is in front of me, because I would like to say, I would hope, because that deal is not in front of me at the moment. I'm not getting paid billions of dollars to hawk cigarettes or something. Because that deal is not in front of me, I can act like my idealized self and say, no, I wouldn't do that. I'm above that. I'm above millions and billions of dollars. I don't need that. But I don't know how I would react if the situation actually came up, because I don't know how you would react if the same situation came up. You'd like to think that you would do the nice thing, but that's a lot of money, and holy crap, could we use it? So I don't know. I'd like to think that I would turn it down. I really would. All right. Whenever I try to explain post-scarcity communism to my dad, he says, but what about the selfish people who want to have more than everybody else? What would you say to that? There's a couple answers you could say to that. You could say that, one, that's not necessarily baked into human nature. That sounds like it's just another turn on the human nature argument, which is shown to be plastic. I don't think there is really such a thing as human nature. Or if there is, it's very, very small. And yeah, I don't have high don't really anticipate that that's really like a thing, but we've been raised to think it is a thing. So there's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy on that. And I do think that it is something we would have to contend with if we like moved to like a communist economy like instantly, because we've been raised in a culture of capitalism, and we have a society that just that talks only about how great, rich, and powerful and psychopathic people are, and we don't like think about we don't venerate other people. So we have like, I don't know, it's just a whole thing. The other argument you could say for post-scarcity communism is that, we always do, like, there is like an aspect where we do feel like we feel good about our status in comparison to other people. And you can do that with things that are non-material. And people do it today. In my mind, people only, like, gather material things in a selfish manner because they want the intangible benefits, which are things like social capital, like being the social capital that comes with being an astronaut. People don't become astronauts because they want to make mad bank. They become astronauts because they want people to be like, holy shit, you're an astronaut. That is amazing. On top of like probably all the cool stuff you get to do as an astronaut, like go to space and shit. And so like, I do think that people who are ambitious and selfish, even without capitalism, will have things for them to strive towards. People who are addicted to attention and prestige will still have things to do, like start YouTube channels, for example. So, it's like, I don't see it as much of a, I don't think that it's going to, like, I don't think that if we had a communist economy, we would end up in a situation where there's nothing to strive for, and that there's no, everybody would be on equal social capital footing. I think that just that what we value would be different, and people would strive for different things. Right now, we have a culture that puts prestige on people who are pathologically selfish. But like, say if we had way more of if we gave more like, social capital to, like, if, we thought that people who worked really hard and were really good people and like really giving citizens and helped others, if those were like the things that we thought we made people awesome, then people who were selfish would strive for those things. Even if they would exist, I think that there's not a ton of them, but like, I do think that that's the reason that we're still gonna get like the doctors and the people doing the really hard work. And this is why, like, actually I think the Soviet Union was trying to do something about this, because the Soviet Union used to do things like give like countrywide like employee of the month awards. Like they would give away these like medals of honor that like are typically reserved for soldiers to people for like being really, really productive in factories and stuff like that, which I always thought was just was kind of cool. Okay, so someone's asking when does the alternate history start? I was just going to start as soon as I ran out of questions to answer, basically, which is now. So let's do our first scenario. Some of them might be longer than others, depending upon how much of a thread there is to pull, but we'll give it a good thing. What do you think of developmentalism? Is third world protectionism good? I don't know what those things are. What if Shrek never happened? Oh man, that could be fun. Alright, what if the Paris Commune evolved into a whole-wide national revolution? Okay, let's bite on that. So the Paris Commune was a briefly lived sort of proto-socialist revolutionary, I wouldn't say state, it was sort of just a commune. Like, it was basically a neighborhood in Paris for about 70 days. I actually was researching this for our upcoming video, so I know quite a bit about the Paris Commune. So, like, I would say that And what happened was is basically they propped up when there was this chaotic period after the Franco-Prussian War where the French government was basically in chaos, and they set this up as sort of an alternative. It didn't last long because the French government from the south basically took it over, and it was done. But the Paris Commune sort of had more of like a real political impact by it trying and failing. I feel like very much the Paris Commune has for leftists, even at the time when it was going on, acted as this sort of remember the Alamo type moment for socialists, where it was this attempt to make a socialist movement. And when that movement happened, it got crushed by the evil capitalist state. That's the story. And I mean, everybody in the century after it happened started writing these long papers about what they thought they did right, what they thought they did wrong, and how they could have improved it, and what was and what went well, and what works and what doesn't. And literally leftists have been fighting about this kind of stuff since it happened, even before it ended. So, for example, Mikhail Bakunin and Vladimir Lenin both wrote long pieces of texts about the Paris Commune. Mikhail Bakunin and Vladimir Lenin probably don't have a whole lot in common with each other. They're about as they maybe disagree with each other about as much as leftists can. And so, but both of them wanted to claim the Paris Commune for themselves. And even to this day, as I was wading into the research on the Paris Commune, I found that who owns the Paris Commune and who was the Paris, who were these communards? Were they communists, or were they anarchists, or what were they? Who did they represent? Who is their their progeny in the future has been debated in leftist circles forever. For example, one of the main books I read was Donnie Gluckstein's book on the Paris Commune, which is a good one. But then the first book review I find on Donnie Gluckstein's book is this whole treatise about why this guy is wrong, because he's a Marxist Leninist who's part of the Socialist Party of Scotland or something, and so Donnie Gluckstein's got all these problematic aspects to him, and all of his comments in the thing are very much this tanky idea, and it's oh crap, okay. And so I guess the biggest question that I would have is what happens if they succeed? Well, because there were sympathy revolutions that happened in various cities around France, but also around Europe. And so the way that I could only see them succeeding, because they weren't super organized. One of the issues that the communards had was that they had they boasted having a military of 10,000 strong, but at any given time, only 12% of them only ever showed up for duty. And so they were extremely outnumbered. And then on top of that, they were in a lot, I think the reason why a lot of people fought in the commune about who belonged to it is because in the commune, they were having these arguments and fighting about it. And they were fighting about what to do. And in my mind, the Paris Commune, I think the thing I'm going to talk about in my videos, I'm going to compare it to a Rorschach test about what kind of leftist you are. If you're a leftist and you study the Paris Commune, the conclusions you come to about it say a lot about what kind of leftist you are. But this is early times. This is socialism before Marx. Well, not before Marx. Socialism before Marxism is the default ideology in the socialist movement. Socialism is way older than okay, I say way older. It's older than Marx and Engels' writing. So in my mind, if the, say, like, I don't know, the French military gets too spread out, like there's too many very powerful sympathy revolutions, and they just get too spread out, and the military is just not able to handle the situation, I could see a couple scenarios coming out of that. One, you could probably see a situation where France has a bunch of, like, France just basically splinters into a bunch of small communes, and the Paris Commune just becomes one of those, maybe the biggest one. So that you get these, like, sort of city-state situation. But in Europe, especially in the Victorian age when this happened, that wouldn't last long. A lot of the most powerful people, like, keep in mind, like, we're talking 1871 here, so this is like, you know, Bismarck and, like, Queen Victoria and just all of these people, and it's just like, it's a situation in which there's very, very powerful empires in Europe that have an extremely strong interest. They have a very strong interest in making sure that there's no that the socialism doesn't win, because there's a socialist at this point in history. There's a socialist movement happening in virtually every country in Europe, and every powerful country is terrified that they're going to get that they're going to take off. And so, in my mind, you get a bunch of these communes, and they try to hang on, and the French government can't handle it, so they last maybe another couple years, while you know, the British and the Spanish and the Germans and the Italians and the Austro-Hungarians all just, like, destroy the place, topple the government, and throw in, you know, another dummy French leader like they did at the end of the Napoleonic era. Because basically, at the end of the Napoleonic era, at the Treaty of Westphalia, they pretty much came together and said, like, we're not going to let a Napoleon happen again. We're going to all work together to take out any of these movements if they ever spring up. And I feel like in the 1870s that the list of allies for the Paris Commune would be very low, especially a Paris Commune that, for example, would not be able to draw upon the resources of its colonial holdings. The other option, which I think would be the more likely option, is they probably still lose. But what happens is the communes, as the communes come to prominence, they sort of band together into this attempt at a state. And so they try to remake France under more like a more socialist type line, the proto-socialist type line. And they do, but like it's this, you know, it's a brand new state. Very chaotic, very just upset and just everyone is not sure what things are going to be like, and it's just chaos. And on top of that, or in that chaos, some sort of Napoleon type figure sort of comes to the fore, and overthrows, basically becomes like the de facto leader of this Paris Commune movement. That would become like I think that if in that sort of era of revolutionary violence, if he were able to someone would come to power because it was a violent revolution, and would basically the people would become the most powerful over a long period of time in that struggle, would be the most violent and authoritarian of the mix. And you would probably have even if France could survive somehow through some miracle, because unlike the Soviet Union, they don't have the First World War to sort of distract the world while they get their shit together. They would turn into basically like an early draft of the Soviet Union, but I doubt that they would survive very long, because that would terrify so many people that they would just come and crush them anyway. I don't really see the Paris Commune surviving in the context that it grew up in. The only reason why the Soviet Union was able to survive like it did is because it happened in 1917 while the rest of the world was at war. And even then, they still tried to instill a whole bunch of even with the war happening, the Western powers still tried to intervene to try and make sure that a monarchist government was survived, and they eventually gave up on it by the time the Russian Civil War ended. So even in the context of the worst war in history that was sapping the resources of the whole planet, they still tried to suppress communism in Russia, and it didn't work. If you think about it, if there wasn't a massive war going on and the Soviet Union happened, I think that it would just is the cat dead? Look to the right. Phoebes, are you dead? No, she's just an old cat that likes sleeping. Hey, Phoebes? She's fine. So the Paris Commune happened way too early I think that the Soviet Union had to happen in a very specific context to survive. And I do think that that's the only way that I think the Soviet Union could have done it. And so, yeah. Yeah, there you go. Now she's having a bath. She's good. Okay, so this is a weird... Okay, so a Joseph Stalin wants 20 million subs. Okay. That's an interesting name for a channel. So let's look at the question. What if the British made the atomic bomb first? Honestly, I know this will sound kind of teleological, but I don't think it would make that much of a difference. The reason why the U.S. was able to become the world superpower that it is today was not just because they had nuclear weapons, but because they needed a situation where, but because the United States had a powerhouse economy that was one of the few industrialized countries to not suffer directly the effects of the Second World War. And so I do think that the U.S. would have probably gotten the plans to make a nuclear weapon from the United Kingdom, and would probably still end up being the preeminent nuclear power, and the Cold War would probably go off without a hitch. Depending upon the context of it, the invention of the nuclear weapon might have shifted the war in some fashion. Germany taking some nuclear hits would definitely make the post-war Europe world look a lot different. If the Allies didn't take Germany, if the Allies took Germany instead of the Soviets, that would change quite a bit. Say the war ended early and the Western powers got a jump on things. So if the British were able to get in there, you might not see the East and West Germany, which would definitely change the dynamics of the Cold War. But the thing is, Britain did not have the economic fortitude to maintain a nuclear arsenal near the end of the 1940s. They were people don't remember this, and they probably still don't, but they will, because this is what Britain will be like after Brexit. Britain maintained food rations for years after for years after the Second World War. And even as late as the 1970s, there were rolling blackouts in the UK because they just couldn't afford to keep the power running. Britain was a huge mess for a long time because of World War II and the loss of the empire. So much so that, like, in the 70s, like, they had, like, Nazis became, like, a really big thing in the UK. And so, you know, a Nazi-ridden country that can't even keep its lights on and is under rations, hardly a country that I think could maintain a powerful nuclear arsenal. And probably a taste of what the UK is going to be like in the 2020s and 2030s under Brexit. Good job, old people in the UK. What if Napoleon never became powerful and the Republic continued? I don't know how that would happen, honestly. Like, if you think about it, given, like, the reason, like, okay, we have to unpack, maybe this, okay, this is the interesting aspect of this. You have to unpack why Napoleon came to power and why Napoleon was so welcomed. And that is because in the revolutionary moment, there was so much chaos, that Napoleon coming to power, to a lot of people, felt like a breath of fresh air, because it meant that we can just go back to being normal. Because by the time Napoleon enters the scene in a big way, the French Revolution has just devolved into a madhouse. Like, the what's it called? The Committee of Public Safety is basically, like, executing everybody who, like, they determine as, like, an enemy of the revolution, which that is a list that gets longer and longer, and they get more and more paranoid. That, like, things were just a mess. And so Napoleon coming to power would just be, was like to them like an end to this whole thing. They thought, like, oh, look, we can have an emperor who also has the ideals of the revolution somewhat. So, like, you know, there you go. So you get into the situation. Yeah, you keep in mind, like, the Jacobins and stuff like that. Not Jacobins. The Sans-Culottes, I think they were called, or something like that. They were, I took a French Revolution class, like, in 2011, 2012, and I'm, like, trying to dig up my memories of this. But, like, these the French Revolutionary government was, like, almost like radical centrists. And I think that, honestly, if we end up in a situation where there's no Napoleon, you end up in a context where basically nobody I feel like you have a situation very much like the one that you're seeing in the sort of Paris Commune story, which is that you have a powerful rest of Europe that wants to see this thing dead, and then they kill it very fast and put in, like, King Louis the 17th or whatever. Or I think it was King Louis the 18th, who was the one they put in place after Napoleon got deposed. Anyways, not long lived, and I imagine that would hurt quite a bit the sort of spirit of the revolution. That the feeling that, like, standing up against the aristocracy would be sort of fruitless, which might result in like the nascent socialist movement that sort of broke off from these liberal revolutions. Because, like, the story as it goes is that there were, like, these liberal revolutions in the 18th and early 19th century. And then after those revolutions, the socialists, when they realized that these like liberal revolutions were not doing anything for them, they were just trying to get these, like, middle class bourgeoisie into power, sort of broke off and decided to do their own thing, and that's basically the birth of like the socialist movement. So they might have been able to make progress without Napoleon, but I do think that Napoleon, with his like legendary box shelling technique and all that kind of stuff, would probably, without that stuff, I feel like they would not be able to get the like massive conquest of Europe that they got in the same revolutionary context. So I theorize that the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, which might be just called the French Revolutionary Wars or something like that, would just not be as successful as under Napoleon. What's your favorite soup? I'm actually a fan of the classic chicken and noodles. Pretty solid. It's hard to mess that one up. Possibility of the Soviet Union taking an actual socialist path. Okay, so how could that happen? How could that happen? You would need another person in like Lenin's inner circle. Like the thing is that the socialists, like the actual socialists, the like non-violent, like the anarchist, non-authoritarian communists were pretty thoroughly pushed out of the inner circle of Lenin during the revolution. You would need, I would think that if you wanted to have like an actual socialist USSR, you would need, shortly after the revolution has gotten rolling, Lenin to just die. And for there to be somebody in the very, very early days who was a little bit more left-leaning to somehow get themselves into the center of the situation. Which would be tough because Lenin's inner circle was made up of all sorts of authoritarian communists. Like, I think the classic one that everyone says is it would have been Stalin or Trotsky, and both of them would have been, I mean, obviously one was probably less worse than the other, but they still would have been fairly, like, authoritarian communist states. And even so, I feel like I'm going to use this excuse too much. But, like, Shrek should become the symbol of young socialists of America, like how Pepe the Frog became for the alt-right. Yeah, that's already gritty. Anyways, so the USSR would probably... God damn. To think about how to get a less authoritarian USSR in the context they were in, you need to have you need to be in some sort of situation in which the Bolsheviks just don't... the Bolsheviks start the revolution, but they don't own the revolution. And, like, they don't, like, you know, like, bump their way into power. And that's a good question. I don't know the answer. I would think that maybe if they won the revolution really fast, like, say, like, the whites just, like, lose really fast, but then, like, the central government sort of doesn't function either, and that falls apart, and, like, Russia becomes really, really decentralized, and all sorts of, like, smaller communes the Soviets start to sort of self-manage, in which case maybe you'd see, like, a complete breaking of the the centralized Soviet power. That could be cool. And in that case, like, small Soviet leaders, like Peter Kropotkin, for example, would be able to organize under their own principles, and maybe some anarchists would actually be able to, you know, do their thing. Oh, man. So many scenarios. I'm totally not going to be able to get to these all, but I can try. How did Gritty become the mascot of the left? Well, that's because everybody, when Gritty became a thing in the in September, everybody thought it was crazy and just like this like ugly thing. But then, so I think it was Jacobin Magazine did a tweet that said Gritty is a worker, and that sort of something about that clicked, and all of a sudden everyone was like, "Oh my god, I love Gritty now," and it's sort of he's very memeable, which is very good for being the mascot for the internet left, and I think that's basically how it happened. Would you punch a fascist? Oh my. So, very interesting question. We got to figure out how to break this apart because there's two answers and some that I have to mention. One, short answer is I probably would not. Unless I was protecting somebody. Second, I probably would really want to, but I would be concerned about the repercussions of such an action on various fronts. And I know that this is not an answer people want to hear, and I'm going to be called a suckdem or something like that. But I have this concept of violence that it is something that feels viscerally good to do, and you might think like it's a very masculine thing to think, yes, the solution to our problem is to punch it and kill it, and then it is solved. We have solved it. You get rid of fascists by just killing all the fascists or punching away the fascists or whatever. But that's not how. But this is a very masculine idea, and I do think I need to like write something about this because I do think that there's something very patriarchal about this idea. But what you don't acknowledge is that while violence might be necessary for short-term safety and the protection of communities, you are doing so at the expense of long-term success. And I'll break that down a little bit because I know that this sounds a lot like the PR argument, and I really think that this is there's a bit more practicality to this than just like, because it would make us look bad. Or where people think that like the sort of straw man of a pacifist, which is that like, but we're above this, so we wouldn't do it. It is the fact that humans, these little flesh bags that walk around the world, are not rational creatures. Our perception is flawed at best. And I want to use a historical example. We were just talking about the USSR, so this is a pretty good example of what to do. Has anybody in here, in the chat, thought about why the Soviet Union broke up? Or why it failed? Because, or another good question, why were some countries in the Soviet bloc so thrilled to see the Soviet Union end? Why were Lithuanians, Estonians, Poles, why are they so adamantly happy that the Soviet Union broke up? Why are they so disillusioned with communism that now they're starting to turn to fascism? And I will say it was because these are not countries that voluntarily turned into communist states. They were brutalized and they were forced to become part of the Soviet Union by violence. They were invaded. And in my mind, like, if you ever talk to somebody, you can talk to, like, I don't care how good your ideas are. I don't care how well thought out your Marxist dialectic is. If communists killed your parents, you're going to hate communists. No matter what your moral North Star is, no matter how ethical or left-wing you might be, communist kills your dad, and you loved your dad, you're going to not like communists. And that is going to be forever tainted in your mind. And you're going to, because you have personal tragedies in your own life that have pushed you to it, you're going to commit violence against that group and whatever it is they represent. Think about how many working class Americans turn to fascists like Donald Trump, not because they have these, not because they initially had these, like, not because they sympathize with far-right opinions right away, but as a visceral rejection to the liberal policies that took away their futures, their children's futures, and their economic situation, or at least what they perceive to be. And so, whenever I think about, like, hey, would you be the person who punched the Richard Spencer? Maybe. But also, I would think, theoretically, there's got to be somebody who knows Richard Spencer and is not a Nazi, maybe doesn't even know about all the Nazi shit he does, and is his friend. And that person might be like, without hearing the context, might hear that Richard Spencer got punched by an Antifa super soldier, and all of a sudden their opinion has changed, and they hate leftists because they punched... Richard Spencer's a bad example because his entire life is about being a activist, a fascist activist. But theoretically, say, you know, in any other context, I guess you could say, you will always be creating, even if you are doing things like necessary to save lives, which I totally get, and in those cases I would still totally do, you are going to, for every, like, cop you kill, for every random clan member that you put in the ground, you're going to create other people who have nothing to do with the movement, but have been brought in ideologically against you and the ideas you stand for because of what you did to somebody that they know and they care about. Because all politics is personal. And also we really gravitate towards narrative. And if you have the narrative of the person being on the offensive and being the aggressors, it's hard for you to build a social movement on that, which is very strange. But that's why the right has gone to ridiculous... Like, they have the most offensive ideology that ever existed. They literally just want to take away rights from other people and reserve them for themselves. So, they've had to completely rebrand to make them look like the downtrodden. And so, in my mind anyway, like with a lot of things, the act of violence, the introduction of force, has to be something done in a calculated fashion, because you are going to create more enemies than you eliminate by doing it. Maybe that's worth it. Maybe that's, like, in order to make the Nazis afraid to go out and speak, maybe it's worth it to commit violence in order to ensure that communities are kept safe. Maybe. I don't have an answer to that question. Not to mention I'm a giant coward who would like to not go to prison. That would be great. But yeah, because you do know that a whining Nazi will definitely try to get you down to the fullest extent of the law. And so you know that you'll be completely screwed. So, you know, I think that if the left is to use violence, it has to be done intentionally, and it has to be done in a fashion that is, you know, that has to be done with thought and premeditation, and not just done not thinking that it is good for its own sake, because it is a thing that makes us feel good. It's very cathartic. It's very simple. It's a simple solution to our problems, and we can very easily justify it as a solution to our problems. But it is like taking steroids. It'll help, but in the long term, there's going to be consequences. And especially when the right owns all of the levers of power, that can be difficult. All right. I feel like I'm starting to finally starting to rev my engine up a little bit. Why didn't Keynesianism last? Keynesianism didn't last because people blamed stagflation on it, and the neoliberals and neoconservatives the neoliberals were really good at promoting their ideas. 255. If you want to know why Keynesianism didn't last, there is a book you should read called A Brief History of Neoliberalism by David Harvey. Probably the best description of what happened in that moment. Probably a pretty important history book to read. Maybe a step back video. That would probably actually be a pretty good one. Right now, I'm looking at the Idea Informer page, and I'm seeing that the top of the list is historical materialism for my next video, which might be interesting, but I'd have to think about how to tell a story there. The nuclear situation makes this impossible, but I'd have a hard time saying using military force to make countries be environmentalists is wrong. That is, yeah, it's a tough metric, and it's definitely a tough balancing act that I don't know if I want to be the person to make that decision. Maybe that makes me a weak leader. Maybe that's the whole problem. Maybe it's just that I'm indecisive and weak. But in my mind, I can't see myself, or I can't imagine myself being that kind of moral arbitrator of who gets to live and die. I feel like that kind of power is not something I want to have over anybody. How can the left and youth in Canada and the US become more connected in person and in community instead of being technology to like Tumblr? Start doing stuff. I feel like anarchists, every time I met up with anarchist groups, they get so bored, and then they start infighting over the dumbest things. They're always like, anytime you go to a city that is of any reasonable size, you're always going to find two anarchist groups because the two groups are mad at each other about something. This always seems to be true. There's at least two because they split up over something. I feel like anarchists need to be They need to less start straight up anarchist leftist groups and instead start like leftist groups that have projects. You know, like I like, instead of having like, you know, the anarchist society of whatever city, why don't you like start a Food Not Bombs? I feel like Food Not Bombs is starting, like joining organizations like that would be are a great way to get out, or just doing art projects, or taking up some function that the state is not doing for you. Like if there are things that we as a community need to pool together to solve because the state's not going to do it, that would be a great thing to start an anarchist leftist organization about. Actually, I wouldn't even call it an anarchist or leftist organization, because it's just an organization that does things and gets people involved to solve problems. One of the things, I was doing research on the Yellow Vest movement, and what I found is people all across the ideological spectrum will sign up for protests and demonstrations and do organizations that are around issues they care about. And so, like, you know, literally making like a committee to fix that pothole that the city won't get around to doing is good. Do that. But I think that also there's the question about like, how do we like break out of our technology bubbles? Because, you know, when you're a leftist, I think this is understandable. I think there's a reason why a lot of you guys are out here watching some random schmuck on like a stream talk to you. And that is, being a leftist is very lonely. You know, you very likely could be the only one you know in person. And I do think that being a leftist is very isolating and lonely. I think on my hands, I'm just lucky that I get to see Thought Slime every week, because he's basically the only leftist that I get to see on a semi-regular basis. And we have our fan meetups. We've had 3 this year, or we have had 2. We're having a 3rd one this weekend. Those are good for this same reason. And so I do think that starting groups that do things that you care about, even if they're things that are just for fun. I would love to start an anarchist bar hop association where you just drink booze together and talk about stuff. Like, it doesn't need to, like, I feel like people think that if you need, that, like, the reason why leftists can organize, because if you want to get around to be to a leftist organization, you have to meet up and do big and important things. But sometimes, if you just want to meet up and make a bunch of vegan stew and give it away to people, like, that is an easy thing that you can do. And trust me, if you say you're going to start an organization that's giving away free food, you're going to attract leftists. Honestly, like, yeah, like, these are situations where I think that the internet can actually help us in the same way that the internet helped Nazis. Nazis were also very isolated and lonely for a very long time until the internet helped them find each other and expose new people to their ideas. I think that being able to make, like, leftists... Have you talked to Thought Slime about your views on pacifism? Oh yeah, I have talked to Thought Slime endlessly about my views on pacifism. We have talked about this a million times. His position is that he sort of understands what I'm saying. He sort of agrees, but has reservations, and also thinks that what I call pacifism isn't necessarily what most people would call pacifism. That's kind of like the summary of the discussions. But yeah, if you I would say that for leftists to get out and do stuff, honestly, this is advice to anybody, is like, really finding groups is not as hard as it used to be. If you go to meetup.com or you go to Facebook groups, you'll find, hopefully, people in your city that you'll be able to connect with. And then just start doing stuff. Honestly, like, leftist organizations become, they're the strongest ones, are built because everyone's friends with each other. And make sure that you're not just, like, meeting up to, like, go over the minutes, but, like, that these are, like, you know, your actual friends. I think that the strongest bonds that we could build as a leftist society is one where everybody is connected to other people based on family and friendship and, you know, closeness. And just kind of go from there. And in some people might live in a place where they really can't. Like, some people do live in the middle of nowhere. And, you know, if you're like in Nowheresville, Alaska, like if you're like one of the people on that like Discovery show who drive trucks on icy highways, yeah, you might be a lonely leftist, but the internet at least lets other people be out there for you. And so the internet is there for you, but if you can find other people in real life, that is a great way to start. And if there is literally nobody in your area, but there are people, like if you're like in a very right-wing city or something, maybe just starting things based around issues instead of ideologies. You might find people who agree with me on more things than you'd be surprised. Like, if you start a free food giveaway situation, you'll probably run into some leftists. And shit, if you go to a soup kitchen or like any place that has that kind of volunteering, you're gonna find a lot of leftists. You can. I think that more people are sympathetic to leftist ideas, but because of the whole cultivated identity aspect of it, they would never identify with being a leftist. Because in my mind, the tenets of leftism, if you took away the actual like lines, like the whole like circles around it, they would most people, like, leftism is basically just generally being a pro-social good person put into politics. It's just that, you know, you need to express the issues that expressing the label, I guess, if that makes sense. And yes, nobody can say no to a good old pot of vegan stew. You know, you make a pot of that, you're going to make lots of friends. All right. I can't imagine ever turning on communists because communists murder my family, though maybe that's the case because I'm already sympathetic to that ideology. Yeah, it might be different, but if you're just like a person on the fence, that's the big thing. So we can have tribal courtesy thing, inform the loved ones of the clan member that he ain't coming home. You could certainly try. I would say, so Grammar's saying, like, you know, if your tactics for protecting the vulnerable are going to make those who threaten them more powerful, then there's a problem with that tactic. I do think that in many ways this is not like a all win or all loss situation. I do think that protecting communities is necessary. And, like, you know, there is cases for saying, like, there is a case to be made for sacrificing long-term success for short-term necessities. What those are, I don't know. I think that people who are more philosophically inclined than I am should think about this question. All right. Have Cody and Thought Slime ever met? Would you say they're ideologically diametric poles of your friendship circle? They have never met. I've only ever in person met Cody once, and it was at VidCon 2017. It was, yeah, and so that was in California in 2017, and Thought Slime lives here in Toronto, and I met him for the first time in January of 2018. So they have never met, and if they did meet, I feel like they would be fighting each other within 5 minutes of meeting. They would never work out. And I'm starting to, I don't know. I feel like I shouldn't air any of my personal stuff at the moment, but I'm starting to worry if if the personal and the political, I thought I could separate more than I could. than I could in actuality, and so I worry about some stuff. But that's not really a thing that I want to get too much into, because that's a bit personal. So, all right. Is Cody a leftist? No, Cody is very much not a leftist. He's like, he's a, I would say, John Kasich conservative. He's identifies as a Republican. He votes Republican. As far as I know, he doesn't like Trump, that's for sure, but he's like a never Trumper type. The closest thing to describe him is like a never Trumper, or like a John Kasich or George Bushy type. Have you ever been to Europe? Yes, I have been on one occasion. I went to France and the UK. What if Lenin had followed Kropotkin's lead and made Russia anarchist? That'd be one hell of a conversation. Okay, let's think about it this way. Maybe this is like our solution to like the leftist, like the actual left wing Soviet Union, and that is, what if like over like, you know, sometime during the revolution, there was some people were drinking booze, you know, they were having their victory vodkas, and Peter Kropotkin, like, you know, this is like 2-3 in the morning, and old man, freaking wizard man Peter Kropotkin, because he looks like a wizard, sits down next to Lenin and starts talking about bread. And just the conversation just kind of goes, and by the morning, Vlad's just like not sure about his whole position, and Vlad just sort of goes like, what the fuck am I doing? I'm like leading this revolution to put this like, to just like replace it with another state. Maybe we need like, what's the solution? Like, we need another way out. And something makes me think that if he pushed too far in that direction, if he pushed too far in that direction, that a certain mustachioed Georgian man would walk into his office late at night and give him the old ice pick, if you know what I mean. Because I feel like Lenin himself only gets so far. But let's say he's even able to control that. Like, say Peter Kropotkin becomes like Lenin's like right-hand man, left-hand man, I guess. And he like manages to like expel Trotsky and Stalin, and, you know, just becomes like this, like, you know, Jedi apprentice for Peter Kropotkin. Maybe after the war is all said and done, so the question is, does the war finish in a positive way? I think so. I think enough people, the war would have won irregardless of the tactics involved. So I think that you're pretty safe on. Because I don't think, like, I don't know. I guess I don't know enough details about the Russian Civil War to know like what exactly got, like, how the Reds won, like what kind of factors led to them winning the war. I don't know that. I'm not that good at Russian history. But if I'm sure, knowing my audience, that there's somebody in the chat who knows a little bit about what advantages the Soviets had that got them into the position where they ended up winning the war. But that would be up to you guys. But it would be super cool to have this imagined situation where once the Civil War is over, Lenin just starts devolving everything and like making everything these like local Soviets, which is like, you know, what the whole idea was actually supposed to be about. And sort of devolves the government and like actually like starts to rule or starts to like push things under more anarchist principles. Now that would be cool. That would be pretty cool to see. Yeah, Lenin was just a bad person. Oh yeah, okay. Well, Gad Yuriv, we're in a hypothetical situation where Peter Kropotkin like visited him on Christmas Eve. Like he got visited by the ghosts of Murray Bookchin, Peter Kropotkin, and Mikhail Bakunin. Like, you know, 3 ghosts came and visited him, and he became an anarchist when he woke up in the morning. Like he had a real change of heart. And also, we're making the concession that like his inner circle didn't also just flat out murder him as well. Once he started changing things. Are you friends with any ANCAPs? I don't think so. I think that Lenin would become a left-wing minarchist who might, maybe, like minarchist, at least, I think that it would be a situation in which win the war and then start to break things down and then sort of spread things out from there to get to an anarchist type situation. I feel like doing it all right away would be would not work in a state of war against monarchist forces. Yeah, if I knew any ANCAPs, the bow tie or the defense of pedophilia, one of those 2 things would give them away. And they would keep asking me about Bitcoin. Thoughts on the newest So That Happened podcast episode? I haven't seen it, or I haven't listened to it. What's your own take on the Roman Empire never happening? I don't know. That's a big one. Like if just say like the Roman, I don't know, like an asteroid just wipes out like Rome when it's just like a tiny little kingdom. Be interesting to think about. I'm listening to myself. All right. So I think that... So let me think. Okay, so Rome gets obliterated. I could see... Okay. Let's say there's a couple things that might come out of that. I could see a more Hellenistic type state, maybe. Something more, not so much like Alexander the Great-esque, but something coming from that part, the Balkans, sort of turning into this more Hellenistic center of power. But I think that one of the more likely things would be that the Bronze Age powers sort of just maintain the places they were in, because the Bronze Age powers at that point were all very powerful. The Egyptians, the Carthaginians, the Visigoths. Actually, the Visigoths were under the heel of the Carthaginians, if I remember correctly. And yeah, so you definitely have like Christianity stemmed quite a bit. And Roman religion doesn't happen, and so the planets would all have different names. But Christianity was like the spread of Christianity. At least Catholicism and the centralized church is definitely was definitely propelled by the Roman Empire adopting it. Without Rome, Christianity would probably just be one of many religions in the Mediterranean world, probably a small one. Because if I remember correctly, Christianity before Catholicism, or before like, you know, anything sort of, actually Christianity itself was sort of this was sort of founded as this like anti-Roman this anti-Roman activist movement within the Jewish community, really. If you think about what Christianity is about, that's pretty much what it was. And maybe without a Roman Empire, there's just no Christianity. Like, just doesn't happen. There's no Christians, or there's no Roman Empire to expel the Jews from Judea. And so kind of Judaism kind of just stays as this like religion in this one region. Without Christianity and with that kind of situation, I imagine that if Islam does happen, it would be very different, under very different circumstances. And then from that point onwards, prediction would get a lot more difficult, because other religious movements, like, it depends upon, like, this is where messing around with the timeline would really test a lot of theories we have about anthropology. Like, for example, is the movement towards monotheistic religions just a part of, is just a function of time, and that's sort of where religious ideas move over time? Does that happen? So does that mean that even without Christianity and a Roman Empire, does just monotheism, does another monotheist religion start up? Does like the Carthaginian, does Carthage like start a monotheistic religion that sort of starts? Like, I could see a future in which Carthage, being rather expansionist in its own right, Carthage becomes like sort of the center of power in the Mediterranean. That could be a thing. That would be an interesting one to see. Be interested to see like Tunisia being the like center of classical civilization and not Rome. That'd be kind of curious if you think about it. But that's its own thing. Like, I feel like at that point it would be hard to predict where things would go, because if you got to see how it went, you'd probably have some interesting answers to questions about what is the nature of like how many of these things are based on sort of historical materialism, or how many of these things were just sort of flukes of circumstance at their time. Like, maybe there's no monotheism, or there's less monotheism, or maybe monotheism is inevitable and it just happens anyway. Like, there'd be curious to see how it all goes. Okay. Next question. What if Shrek never happened? Here we go. This person really wanted me to say their name. Captain Squid. So, if Shrek never happened... So, Shrek. What can we say about Shrek? What do we know about Shrek? Shrek is a movie. Several movies. Okay. Shrek was a DreamWorks film. And if I remember correctly, now I'm not like an expert on this, but I do think that Shrek was started by a former Disney executive, or was made by a former Disney executive, and DreamWorks has a lot of former Disney people working there. And that, like, Shrek was successful because it was this sort of cynical satire of Disney movies that popped up just as the Disney Renaissance was coming to an end, which means that people were ready to hate on Disney, and Shrek was right there to capitalize on that feeling. I wonder what happens without it. Have we ever been in a situation in which, like, we're in this cultural moment where we're really sick of something and something doesn't come up making fun of it? Maybe something does. So maybe we get another movie that sort of fulfills a similar function of being this, like, funny, irreverent, sort of pastiche on the tropes of the Disney formula. And that sort of fills the place of Shrek. Maybe it's not as successful. In that case, maybe the whole Disney formula lasts a bit longer. Maybe Lilo and Stitch does better in the box office. Or, wait, no, Lilo and Stitch was before Shrek. So, and definitely, like, you know, you've got Mike Myers and Eddie Murphy and John Lithgow in them. Like that movie probably helped their career. I imagine that would have been a setback if they had never ended up. Smash Mouth All-Star would have probably, in my opinion, I was actually talking about this on Saturday. All-Star would have still been associated with movies because I happen to remember. Now I know a lot of you guys are pretty young, so you might not remember this movie, but in the late '90s, there was a movie that came out before Shrek that had All-Star in the as its like signature song. And it was I want to say 1998, but I think I'm wrong. It might have been 2000. But it was a film called Mystery Men. And it's a movie that I am genuinely surprised has not been remade in the modern times, because it is a movie that we just did not, like, just kind of got totally forgotten. And so it was this movie. Lilo and Stitch is after Shrek. Okay. So Mystery Men was this comedy action movie. It was a superhero movie. And it starred Ben Stiller, Janine Garofalo, Pee Wee Herman, and that guy from Fargo, the movie, not the show, and two other people I can't remember. And it was about this group of like hobbyist superheroes who really sucked at fighting crime, but then like the city's like big important superhero gets captured by like the supervillain, and William H. Macy, that's it. He plays the shoveler who fights with a shovel. And so in the movie, these hobbyist crappy superheroes all of a sudden have to become like real superheroes. And all right, let me see if I can remember them all. So Ben Stiller's character was Mr. Furious, and he was like the main character of the movie, where his whole thing is that he would just rage out and just get really mad, and that was it. And like anytime someone was like, "Oh, like what's your power?" He's just like, I get really mad. And then there's so many scenes of him like raging out and then like not being able to do anything because he's just mad. His name was Mr. Furious. And then Janine Garofalo's character was called the Bowler, and she had a bowling ball that had her dead father's skull inside of it. And this bowling ball basically was possessed. And so she could throw the bowling ball, and the bowling ball had like a mind of its own, and it could smash into things. So that was actually pretty cool. Then there was what's his name's character, William H. Macy's character, who played the shoveler, who had a shovel and hit things with it. And then there was a guy who could turn invisible, but only when nobody was looking. Yes, and that one nobody believed him until like the end of the thing. And then there was the Blue Raja, who was this British guy dressed up like an Indian guy. It was an American guy doing a British accent dressed up like an Indian guy, but didn't have any blue on him, even though he was called the Blue Raja. And his whole thing was that he threw forks. That was his whole like shtick, is that he was like, he like threw forks with deadly accuracy. And then there was Pee Wee Herman's character, who was I can't remember the superhero name he had, but he basically had weaponized flatulence. Like he was like cursed or something. Oh no, he was the Sphinx. Then who was the fart guy? But like he basically he got cursed. Like he did it. Like he farted in an elevator or something, and he blamed it on like a witch doctor, and the witch doctor cursed him so that he like farts all the time. And yeah, Pee-wee's The Sphinx was like that guy. The Spleen. The Spleen was his name. Now I remember. And he could. And so like that was his thing. It was like anybody pulled his finger, he could fart, and he had these like weaponized farts, and that was supremely hilarious. And then there was so that was like the main cast, and then there was this like guy who like kind of like trained them on how to be good superheroes during like a montage thing, and it starred or they got trained by this guy named the Sphinx, who is just quote unquote terribly mysterious, and this movie happened, but the main thing is that this movie was the main theme song of the movie was Smash Mouth's All Star. And so that's why I remember this movie. Because everybody keeps thinking of Shrek when they think of the movie All Star, but I always think of Mystery Men. And I'm like one of maybe like 4 people who remembers this movie. And like 3 of us are in this chat room. No, this is a real movie that actually happened. I'm going to find its IMDb page so you know that I'm not full of shit. Okay, it came out in 1999. Okay, so the Invisible Boy is played by Kel Mitchell, who I don't remember from anything else. And the Spleen was Paul Rubens. Okay. Yeah. So, Hank Azaria, freaking Apu, played that Blue Raja. Man, he is not good at Indian representation at all, is he? Jeez. Hank Azaria is the guy who does the voice of Apu. Oh, jeez. Okay. Yeah, I feel like Indian people should not be fans of Hank Azaria. He has not done them a service. All right, so George H.W. Bush is dead. What do you think about him and his legacy? Well, 255 AD. I actually did on... I did a huge tweet thread on the day that he died. Like, over 40 tweets long. That is sort of a blog post about the significance of the historical figure George H.W. Bush. And I'll get my comments at the end here. Was basically... let's say, he wasn't a hero. He was at best an ineffective leader, which given his draconian politics might have been a good thing. The world is a worse place because he was in it, but not by much. He rode on the coattails of more ambitious and ideologically driven people. And after his time in the limelight was over, he didn't amount to much at all. 100 years from now, he'll be little more than another one of those long string of emperors kids will need to remember between hurricane and radiation drills. So that was like my conclusions about George H.W. I'm gonna give you guys I'm scrolling up right now because I got to get to the top of the long thread. If you want to read the blog, the epic tweet thread, keep in mind this will be a little bit of a read. But if you want to see this, like it's like the history of George Bush and him as like a person. So if you want to check that out, there's a link there for you to like take a look at. Pet the kitty now. All right. There we go. See you later, Kent Brockman. Okay. Now, where was I? All right, what if Christianity wasn't co-opted? All right, this is from Logan Anderson, who she or he wants to know about, okay, if Christianity wasn't co-opted, like co-opted by like the Romans? Co-opted by like the plutocrats? I do think that Christianity being quote unquote co-opted by like the Roman Empire is the reason why it's the largest religion on earth right now. I don't think it would have survived that long, or I'm not saying it wouldn't survive. I don't think that it would have. I don't think that it would have lived on forever if or it wouldn't have been like the dominant religion. It would have been a smaller sort of Middle Eastern, North African religion, like it kind of was before the Roman Empire got a hold of it. If you watch my video on the Gnostics, you'll get a good idea of like where Christianity was before it started getting really centrally organized. And without the Roman sort of takeover, I imagine it would have stayed more like that, which meant that Christianity would have been way different. There would have been less unifying attributes. And which means that like the doctrine would have been very different, which makes me think that that plus a lot more time would have resulted in Christianity itself not really being this like unified religion, but being like many, many, many religions that can like trace their origins to the Christian movement that happened in the classical age. So I imagine that there'd be a lot of religions probably that have become extremely different from each other, that might be sort of related to each other in the same way that like Christianity and Islam are related through Judaism, like that kind of idea. Like it would start like a new like kind of branch of the Abrahamic religions. At least that's my theory. What if yellow erupted in 1777 midway through the American Revolution? Yellow? Is this a certain volcano? Let me just... Yellow eruption. Oh, the Yellowstone volcano. Oh boy, the Yellowstone caldera. Well, like, I don't know, like I've seen some like things about this. Like it's a super volcano, isn't it? Like if Yellowstone exploded or erupted, like you could count out a lot of things. Like that's like almost like people have talked about it like, yeah, being like an apocalyptic type event for humanity. How it would affect the American Revolution is different from like how it would affect humanity with like causing like 10 years of winter and like all that kind of stuff. But shit, man, that is a great, that would be an amazing alternate history novel right there. The American Revolution, but in the middle of it, friggin' Yellowstone caldera explodes. Didn't what's his face? Didn't Harry Turtledove write a novel about the Yellowstone volcano erupting? Or am I just like making that up? But either way, man, what a crazy, like, you know, apocalypse in the middle of the American Revolution. That would be just fascinating to see. Damn, that's actually like really inspiring. It's like, man, I want to write that story. Only, bro, the issue is that it's not the 10 years of winter is not so much the problem as the reason why you had 10 years of winter is because the Yellowstone or a volcanic explosion puts tons of ash in the atmosphere. So 10 years of winter results in basically blocking sunlight. Like it's not 10 years. It's not just 10 years of winter. It's like 10 years of like nighttime. Like the sun is blocked out, which means that like plants that photosynthesize wouldn't be able to grow. Like there'd be mass starvation. Like it would be pretty tough. Okay, maybe not nighttime, but like a dusk. If you guys know anybody who was alive in like the 1980s and like old enough to remember, ask them how they remember Mount St. Helens when it exploded. When Mount St. Helens exploded, like people were seeing like weird stuff in the air, like as far as over here, and it was like over on the West Coast. So like the caldera exploding, like the Yellowstone caldera exploding would be a total apocalypse. But man, do I want to write that story. I think that okay, let's see. Where did I'm not going to give that to Cody to write. I want that for myself. I want to write my own story. It was snowing black. Oh man. There's actually, interesting enough, there is this, so one of these things, by the way, if you're like some sort of scientific racist or fascist, you might want to close your ears right now. One of the things, this is an interesting story about volcanoes. One of the interesting stories about humanity and the genetic study of humans. So if you do a genetic analysis of the human species, one thing that makes us weird compared to a lot of other animals is that we're very, very similar to each other. Like, the whole idea of like, oh yeah, there's different breeds of dog and stuff like that, but that's because your average two dogs are very genetically distant compared to any two humans. Humans are remarkably homogeneous. I believe that was a Greek philosopher, right? Anyways. And there's a lot of people who are trying to make theories as to why. Like, what makes it so, why is there so little human genetic diversity? And there's a prominent theory that sometime in the Paleolithic age, so sometime when like humans were basically hunter-gatherer type folks, that there was a massive volcano, there's a big volcanic explosion that wiped out almost all of humanity, and that like we are already post-apocalyptic. The Earth, like we already, like most humans already died off. And that volcano, like I think it's called like the Toba eruption theory, but like, yeah. So I think it's called the Toba eruption theory, and it's this idea. It's trying to explain like maybe a lot of humans died off, and that's why now all the humans who exist today are so similar to each other, to the point where like it's actually kind of scary how little we actually have. Like, you know how people always say like, oh, we're like 99.99% the same DNA and like 97% with like a chimpanzee. But like other animals, it's not, I mean, it's still pretty close, but it's not that close. Like we are weird in that sense. Which I think is interesting. It also makes me think about how cool it would be if that volcano did not go off, and how humanity with more genetic diversity might have turned out. Might have been living in like Tolkien world where there's like elves and dwarves and or something akin to that, you know, human adjacent type species. Can you do a video about the Yellow Jacket protests? I am already on it. Do not worry. I was working on that today. I'll be making it tomorrow. What do you think about during the American Civil War, people compared it to the end times, hence songs like Battle Hymn of the Republic came to be? Why do you think that happened? I think that, well, it's because it's how Christianity is. Christianity is a religion that is founded in the fundamental belief that the earth only will exist for so long. One of the things that is key, and I think that Christianity would not be Christianity without it, is the belief in a very specific type of apocalypse that has the four horsemen and the Antichrist and the big revelation war at the end of humanity and like all those kinds of things. And Christianity is still based on this this sort of millennialist thinking, like this belief that we're just sort of biding our time. And if you do a study of Christians today, a good percentage of them think that they will see this the events of this apocalypse unfold in their lifetime. A surprisingly high percentage. it goes way up in like the evangelical community. And I think that every single like and like there was this whole idea that like if you have a biblical worldview, your idea of your concept of history and the way that the world works is that everything was better in the past and that we are on a process of devolution, that things are getting worse and worse and worse as we lead up to apocalypse. This is why, if you like read the Bible and you think of its stories, in the past, we lived in paradise, and then we lost paradise. And then people were giant and lived to be 900 plus years old. And then we angered God, and that was taken away. And the story is like humans get smaller and weaker, and they live less long, and we're just like racking up punishments and death and all these things. And then Jesus sort of changes that, saying, oh, look, like we're going to like, you've been forgiven of all these things. We're not going to make you live to be 900 anymore, or, you know, we're not going to get you back to Eden, but you can be forgiven for stuff when I come back. Because Jesus, the whole story is that he dies and is resurrected, and he's like, all right, I'm going to go off and like get ready for the end of the world. You guys wait for me to come back. And then they just kind of keep waiting and waiting. And so there's the idea that like the world's just going to keep getting worse until Jesus ever comes back. And so the biblical worldview is this idea that any minute now, the world's going to end. And some see Revelations as prophecy, and so they actually try to make the things that need to happen in order for the prophecy to be fulfilled and in order for Revelations to happen. And some of these are things like, so like the Jews need to have Jerusalem again. So that's why there's a lot of evangelical support for Israel. The Temple of Solomon needs to be rebuilt. And there was like a huge like evangelical Christian freak out when Saddam Hussein decided to, because the Temple of, not the Temple of Solomon, there's another temple that has to be rebuilt. I'm sure Kelly will tell me in a second. But this temple is in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein, when he was in charge, was doing a historic restoration of this temple. And evangelicals were like, look, it's a sign. Like, there was a sign movement that people thought that Saddam Hussein was the Antichrist because he's like rebuilding this this temple. And then on top of that, the destroyed temple in Jerusalem, the Temple of Solomon, also has to be the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem also has to be rebuilt, because if you know about Jewish history, is there's like the first Temple of Solomon that was destroyed, and then the second Temple of Solomon, which was destroyed. And if you go to Jerusalem today, Jews go to one of the remaining walls of the second Temple of Solomon, which is called the Wailing Wall, and they still go to it to this day. And there's a mosque built on top of it now, so like that's a whole thing. But one of like the key things that needs to happen in order for the end times to start is that the third Temple of Solomon needs to be built. And the Jews will want to do that because the Jews would see the third Temple of Solomon as like a big victory for their faith. And so the Christians would say, okay, like the third Temple of Solomon, that's like one of the signs of the apocalypse. Another one is there's another temple or another building that's in Iraq that needs to be rebuilt. And I know that one Saddam Hussein tried to rebuild, and there's like a whole thing. Then the Antichrist has to be born. Then things get really, really funky, because that's when like you get to like the 7-headed serpent with like 10 crowns, and the number 666 is the number, and there's like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and like it's a whole thing, man. Revelations is a trip. You should read it sometime. So that's why Christians during the Civil War were saying that the universe was coming to an end because of the Civil War, because Christians don't need a lot of convincing to think that the world's coming to an end. All right. What if Hitler slips and dies in the shower in 1940? So 1940, the war is starting, and actually it's during a time when the Axis is doing well. I could see things like... See, like, the thing is that a lot of the bad decisions that the Germans made that led to their defeat were at the hands of Hitler. And that, like, the push for, like, more and more violence, more and more genocide, and more bad stuff all kind of comes from Hitler's decisions. I'm wondering if, like, with the Nazis gone, like, or if with Hitler gone, that, like, the anti-Semitism Nazi stuff would get, would still, I mean, it would still persist. It would probably still be pretty terrible. But I'm wondering if it would, like, the really dumb decisions would not happen. And that would maybe lead to more success for the Axis. Although I know that, like, they were always in a really tough situation. They basically were on a time limit. They knew that the Americans were always going to get involved. And so they basically wanted to knock everybody out of the war before the Americans could get involved. But I don't know. I would probably say if the war lasted long enough, I don't think the Germans could win. I don't really think there was, like, a real success for the Germans in World War II. It was just a matter of time. Unless you had, like, the United States, like, getting really, really lazy. Himmler would probably still push for genocide. Yeah, that's probably true. If we just built the Temple of Solomon, under the Dome of the Rock, everyone gets what they want. There you go. I never said that. I never said that Hitler wasn't anti-Semitic. He definitely was anti-Semitic. The most anti-Semitic person in history, I would argue. You're going to bed 2:55 AD. I am sorry. I know this stream is really late for you guys in Europe. I don't think Russia would invade Germany. Russia was very, like... One of the things is that, like, the German invasion of the Soviet Union was actually, like, a surprise. Like, Stalin didn't believe it at first for a few days. And then he was so shocked by it and so, like, terrified that he actually, like, hid in his room for, like, I think almost, like, 48 hours before he came out and did stuff. It's a whole thing. All right. Well, now that 255 AD has gone to bed, like, what if Constantine died in AD 310? Would Christianity still become a world religion without him? I think so. I think Charlemagne only... Wait, he didn't say Charlemagne, did he? Constantine. Oh, if Constantine didn't spread Christianity, then yeah, I'm definitely on board with Constantine. Constantine, yeah, Christianity is pretty reliant on Constantine doing his thing. Although, I do think that maybe to kind of, like, de-great man history this thing, I think that Christianity was big enough in Rome at that time that there would have been a Roman emperor who switched to Christianity at some point, but it might not have happened that early. It might have happened later, because I think Constantine sort of did it despite the political reasonings, but I think that a lot of people argue that he did it as, like, a political act. And yeah, Phoebe's back. Oh man! All right, the next question. We're gonna have to work on this for a bit. This one might be tough, and I don't know if I have the brain power to really do it. The true star of the show has returned. Did you hear that, Phoebes? Hey. How is becoming Christian advantageous, though? Well, Christianity was a growing religion in the Roman Empire at that time. And basically, if there was there was a lot of unrest related to Christianity in the Roman Empire. And if a Roman emperor could embrace Christianity and sort of get it under his control, that he could be very powerful. That was basically the idea. So the next question is, what if Al Gore had become president? So, I mean, it's easy to say how that would have turned out because, or how that would have, like the point of the origin of such a thing, because, I mean, it was only like a few votes in Florida that basically decided it, right? So, yeah. Let's think about that. So Al Gore becomes president. Hi everybody, I'm Al Gore. So Al Gore. So there's a couple things. Al Gore cared about climate change, so that'd be nice. Be nice if the U.S. actually did some stuff. Good night, 255 AD. I do think that Al Gore would have probably switched things up with climate change. Probably would have taken it a bit more seriously, but the president is only so strong, and so I do think that there would probably be not as much as you think that we would like to happen. I think that Al Gore got to be more extreme about climate policy because he wasn't president than because he was president. And he might have been like, he might have done some environmental stuff, but probably not as much as you'd think that Al Gore, because of like how Al Gore acts now, he would have been. But he would have done some things because Al Gore was a champion about climate change like all the way back to the 1980s. Like he's an OG. Like he's pretty good at his stance on climate change was pretty solid well before the election of them. Then we get to 9/11. And that's the part where I'm really, really curious. So not because I would say that the Afghanistan war is very like nailed it. Like Afghanistan war is totally going to happen. Doesn't matter who's president. So I think that Al Gore would definitely have gotten the U.S. involved in a war in Afghanistan. Iraq, I don't think so. Iraq wouldn't have happened. If it wasn't for the Bush era neocons that joined the new Bush era neocons in the White House, there wouldn't have been an Iraq war. Iraq war was on the neocon dream board for years, and so I like that wouldn't have happened without President Gore. It would have just been the Afghanistan war, which makes me think like, okay, Al Gore doesn't go to war with Iraq. Something makes me think that like the backlash against the war on terror would not have been as strong if it wasn't for the Iraq war, which is huge. Maybe even the Afghanistan war doesn't last as long as people think it does. I don't know. Al Gore probably gets reelected just on like 9/11 energy. I definitely think, and also, so that means that Al Gore is president until 2008. At that point, like, who becomes president? Like, it might be a Republican who thinks like, maybe the fight is like about how soft people are on terrorism, and maybe like, so 2008. I do think that like, yeah, I would think that, yeah, Obama probably not a thing because Obama got his whole shtick by his whole like entrance to the political sphere was a speech he gave at the Democratic National Convention in 2004, I want to say. Jeb wins 2008. I actually have to think because like the Republican field, like after 4 years or after 8 years of Al Gore being president, a sort of center lefty Democrat who is mired in this like endless war in Afghanistan, but not a second war in Iraq, which means that the U.S. probably wouldn't have gone into massive amounts of debt. So the economy actually, like all of the Bush like deregulations on the economy might not have happened, which means that it would just have been the Clinton era deregulation of with getting rid of Glass-Steagall. And so with Glass-Steagall gone, but without the Bush deregulations on the housing market, do you end up with the 2008 recession? That's a good question. I don't think so. Or at least not in like the biggest way, because capitalism always has booms and busts. That's just, capitalism is inherently precarious and unstable. That's why it's a system I'm advocating to get rid of. But do you get like this massive collapse like you get in 2008? I don't know. And so you could end up with a Democrat winning after Al Gore, depending upon how good, like ways that you can get the party to continue. Let me just find this. This is a pretty good indicator, and it's something called Keys to the White House. And it's this theorist. This guy has this theory, and it's he's predicted a lot of presidents using this, and it's this handful of these 13 things, and if he gets, I think if he wins more than like if the president who's running gets more than like a handful of them, they're probably going to keep the presidency. The party. So the 13 keys are, so here are the 13. There are 13 statements about the presidency the party going into the election as an incumbent. And if they lose 5 or more of these, then it's likely the other party's going to win. So, and this has predicted a lot of presidents. And I remember during the 2016 election that this guy predicted that Trump would win. And here we are, Hell World 2018. So he's predicted almost every presidency. I think there was like one exception. So the first one is party mandate. After the midterm elections, the incumbent party holds more seats in the U.S. House of Representatives than after the previous midterm elections. So that one we can't predict because we don't know how the midterms in our alternate 2006 election go. Contest. There's no serious contest in the incumbent party nomination. Well, the Republicans needed Trump in 2016, if you think about it, because they really don't have any breakout leaders, especially on 2008 pre-Tea Party. Like, they have no, like, natural person who's going to come and wrangle the party together in 2008. That's why they ran John McCain. They're always scraping the bottom of the barrel. So I think the Democrats would have it on that. The incumbent party is the sitting president. All right. Third party, there's no significant third party or independent campaign. We'll just take that as a given because those are pretty rare. Short-term economy. The economy is not in recession during the election campaign. Let's say that the housing recession doesn't happen, but a similar recession does happen because there's still the Glass-Steagall deregulation, which means that there was still like a lot of unregulated investments with other people's money. But let's say the subprime mortgage crisis is not what causes it, but just that the economy gets bogged down with the war in Afghanistan. Long-term economy. The real per capita economic growth during the term equals or exceeds mean growth during the previous 2 terms. Okay. So that means that per capita growth exceeds the average growth. So that means that your party will stay in power if you're not in a state of growing inequality, because you need the per capita income and the median income to be growing, or the per capita income to be growing faster than the median income, or mean income. All right, next one is policy change. The incumbent administration affects a major changes in the national policy. So there's a good one. Social unrest. There's no sustained social unrest during the term. I think that we kind of talked about how this would kind of not have happened, like the anti-Bush stuff. Scandal. The incumbent administration is untainted by a major scandal. I don't know of any Al Gore scandals that happened in the 2000s. If you guys know of one, let me know. Foreign and military failure. The incumbent administration suffers no major failure in foreign or military affairs. We got Afghanistan, so Afghanistan is, a thing. Or foreign/military success. The incumbent administration achieves a major success in foreign or military affairs. incumbent charisma. The incumbent party has is a charismatic or a national hero, and challenger charisma, and that is having the opposite party having no charismatic leader. And so you need to have at least you can only lose 5 of those. And if the incumbent presidential party loses more than 5, then the idea is that's when party changes happen. And I could very easily see, but that's also probably a limit of imagination, a Al Gore presidency having a lot of those, having enough to get a Democrat elected in 2008. Would it be Obama? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. There's too many factors to play. I feel like it would be easier to rise rank in the Democratic Party if you're like, I feel like in the opposition, it's easier for new leaders to enter the party and rise rank than when they're in government. Which makes me think that the Democrats, the thing is, that would be a huge change too, because that would mean 8 years of Clinton and 8 years of Al Gore, which would make people think like, oh man, the Republican Party is a goddamn mess. If the Democrats win in 2008, yeah, that would be like, the Republicans would probably start being in really, really bad shape. Like, losing the presidency for that many terms in a row would probably feel real bad, man. And depending, I don't know, like the 2008 president, I don't know who it would be. I'm trying to think of who was high in the party at that time. Maybe Nancy Pelosi. She might run for president. I don't know. Because she would probably have been able to make a go for it in 2008. Who's another big person in the Democratic Party? There'd be Joe Biden. Joe Biden might have, like, he ran for president in the 2008. Ross Perot. I'm trying to think of like who would run. If it was Joe Biden, I bet Joe Biden could have won that election. His politics are bad, but he would win elections. But it's a cool concept. Hillary Clinton also could have run. Yeah, I guess without Obama, Hillary Clinton probably would have run for president. In which case, the Republican president who gets elected in 2008, whoever that would be, maybe John McCain, maybe trying to think who else was running. I'm trying to remember. Okay, I'm trying to really dig back and remember the 2008 Republican primaries. I think I'm recalling that was the one in which, like, Rick Santorum looked like he was doing well for a while. And, like, there was that one lady that was really scary looking, that, like, had, like, the crazy eyes. I'm trying to remember. And then I think some magazine ran her on the front page, and she had this, like, terrifying look on her face. I can't remember her name anymore, though. Yeah, it's escaping me. Then there was the one lady who said that she was not a witch. I remember that distinctly from the 2008 primaries. Not Sarah Palin. This was somebody else. She was like, this person was like, Mitt Romney did run. God, let me think. This person had, like, really far-right political opinions. And she was... oh, yeah, Mike Huckabee ran. Rudolph Giuliani ran. I forgot about that. And, oh, yeah, then there's Keyes, Fred Thompson. Oh, yeah, Ron Paul made a big thing. Michelle Bachmann. Michelle Bachmann, that was it. Michelle Bachmann was, like, the person who ran in 2008, the Republican primaries, and she was, like, an absolute psychopath. That would have been a weird one to see. Or am I thinking of 2012? Either way, John McCain and Mitt Romney were, like, the two front runners of the 2008. I do think that John McCain, like, he was like a deeply ingrained part of the. Christine O'Donnell was the one who said, I'm not a witch, I'm you. She was the one who, like, literally was, like, so evangelical Christian that she was like, oh yeah, like, when I was a kid, I, like, worshipped Satan and was, like, into witchcraft, and then, like, had to actually, like, somebody, like, accused her of this, and so she had to, like, it was the most, like, Republican thing ever, because she had to do an entire ad saying to the American people, I'm not a witch, which is, like, the only political party, I think, in the world right now where, like, being accused of witchcraft is, like, an actual, like, thing that would damage your political career. Because America. Okay. So 2012. Howard Dean would have made a good run for 2008. Okay, so no women ran in 2008 for Republicans. Yeah, I am thinking of the Mitt Romney election. All right, so I have to go back even further to 2008. Okay. This is tough. Jeez. That takes me back. Okay. That could have been a bunch. Let's get away from playing electoral politics. I feel like I'm gonna look and I'm gonna be like, oh yeah, the viewers, yeah, everyone is left, of course. Being a Celtic on a Roman farm in 77 BC, being an African slave on a U.S. cotton plantation in 1799, or being a North Korean slave in a North Korean work camp in AD 2018, which is worse? Definitely, I think being a African slave on a U.S. cotton plantation in 1799 would be the worst of all those situations. There was a plan. Oh man, I don't know if I'll be able to do this one, but let's read it out, and maybe you guys in the chat can help me with it. There was a plan between Tito and the Greek Communist Party when the Greek Communist Party won the Civil War to join them to a united Balkan Democratic Republic. How do you think it would end up? Whew. So, like, this is like an idea where, like, basically Yugoslavia includes Greece. Yikes. I know that Albanians would feel really nervous. I feel like Albania would be like, what? We're completely surrounded by this, like, new, like, turbo Yugoslavia. Honestly, I don't have a lot I can say about this. I don't really know a ton about Yugoslavian politics and Tito, but the idea of a Greece that is made up, or Greece, like communist Greece, on top of like a big Yugoslavia, that feels. I feel like that'd be bad for Greece in the long term, because when Yugoslavia broke up, all the countries really went through some terrible shit. Oh, I don't know. It's interesting to think about, but I'm not good enough at Yugoslavian politics to do this. I'm sorry. Oh yes, I have to, before I forget. Also, I have to do. I'm going to take off in a second, but I do need to. I'm going to show you. I'm going to tell you guys about a thing. First of all, a Step Back viewer wants me to point out that he's been working with some other people to make this alternate history book called the People's Socialist Atlas, and apparently it's got, if you're really into alternate history and you're really into like maps and stuff, they made this whole book that's like this 2018 look at America if there had been a successful communist revolution at some point in its history, including with like basically like it's like a fake history book. And I think they raised money for it, and the book goes on sale on Friday, and so I'm giving you guys a link to it because the viewer asked me very kindly to point it out, so definitely worth checking out. And on that note, I think I'm going to have to call it a night. I am supremely exhausted. But yeah, this is really fun. And, you know, this is the third one, so we'll probably do more in the future. Yeah. If any of you are in Toronto, on Saturday we're having another fan meetup. It's going to be at 8 o'clock at a bar called Disgraceland. It's on Bloor Street. You can find it. You Google map search it, and you'll find it. I think you guys will really enjoy. Did the theoretical government give independence to the remaining indigenous people? You should go and find out. I don't know. Anyways, it's been real, and I'll see you guys next Tuesday. If you haven't watched the AIDS video, and I'll have another video coming out on Thursday. Inshallah. Anyways, have a good night, friends.